Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright, published by Fortress Press in 2013. We've completed the chapter on Jewish identity for Paul, and now we're going to move into the chapter on Greek identity, and we're going to have a few surprises because I was very much surprised at the direction that this chapter took, because I, of course, remembered Acts 17 when Paul was invited to lecture at the academy in Athens, and I always assumed that was the Academy of Plato, Plato's Academy, that was meeting, even though it was less structured at that time. But I've found out that that painted porch, or that colonnade, was actually the area for the Stoic school. So Paul was actually invited and speaking to the Stoics in Acts 17. That was new information to me. So it was a great help for me to understand that chapter in Acts. So we'll begin this lesson by looking at the triad on the left. We're going to take a look at the Greek dialectic of wisdom. The Greeks sought not only to understand the world, but also how to change the world. The philosophical sciences consisted of the physics, which addressed everything that is, ethics, which of course discussed behavior, but it was closely related to physics also, so learning through doing. And then logic, or epistemology, through the concept of the logos. Paul did debate Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in Athens, and Strabo was a Stoic philosopher even in Tarsus. So Paul's dialectical position in Colossians 2:4, we learn that Paul warned not to be taken captive by philosophy. And Paul set up a dualism between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of God that he had discovered in Christ. So for Paul, he described himself as a apostolos ethnon, or an apostle to the Greek nations. He was an apostle to the nations. And so he took as his task to present a Jewish message of the wisdom in Christ to a pagan world, to the wisdom of the world. Now if you look at block 2, this teaching by Paul was also an existential and spiritual summons. It was the summons of wisdom in that same act of negation of worldly wisdom. Summons for Paul, there was a fresh summons of wisdom that had Advent appeared in the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. For Paul, Jesus Christ represented a fresh summons of wisdom. Now there are two key aspects of Paul's encounter with the Greek culture. And the first was the confrontation. He confronted the pagan polytheism with a Jewish monotheism. Also, he confronted pagan pornography with a very strict sexual ethics. He also took up an adaptation, in his own words, by taking every Greek thought captive and evaluating it within the critique of the gospel of Christ. He described that as taking thought captive, taking secular philosophy captive, every thought of it, and critiquing it through the lens of the gospel of Christ. So he did have a necessary step of negation within this summoning of the gospel, by negating traditional Greek pantheon of deities, by negating the initiation of mystery religions, and by negating, through the filter of the language of the temple, and the oracle of the wisdom of God and the priesthood of Jesus Christ, the priesthood of Christ as the Lord, as a Kyrios Lord. And so the daimones, Paul considered himself to be in a spiritual battle. He was battling the daimones, the demons. The daimones were perceived as being behind all pagan religion, all pagan thought, and they influenced the pagans through deception. So for Paul, he was involved in a spiritual battle against the daimones. He was battling a spiritual battle by presenting the wisdom in Jesus Christ. It was a spiritual battle of confronting secular polytheism and pagan promiscuity with the wisdom in Christ, and confronting the daimones, deceivers behind pagan philosophy. So we can look at block 3 now, and we can look at the wisdom and the theme of God's faithfulness. It's important to understand here that there was the positing by Paul of the teleosis, or the divine order of reality revealed in Christ. There's a new teleology, a new teleosis. And he also posited an ethic of phronesis, which means a practical, concrete ethic that would be involved in this world with the truth of Christ, and a fellowship of agape self-giving. So he posited the teleosis in Christ, the phronesis in Christ, and the agape self-giving in Christ, all through understanding the Kyrios lordship of Christ. He has been exalted as Lord. And this summons by Paul was to affect philosophy, religion, and politics. Every dimension was to be confronted by the gospel of Christ, because he was proclaiming a new lordship. He was proclaiming a new lordship that was transcendent over every Greek philosophy and every Roman lordship. So the 3 key aspects of Paul as a philosopher: he addressed the signs of his day within Greek culture, and the ideal knowledge of the wisdom in Christ had to become practical and concrete for Paul. It always was a wisdom that needed to become practical and concrete. He also posited the relevance of the dialectic and summons of the wisdom of God in Christ, which is delivered through the act of mission. For Paul, epistemology is tied together with missiology. Missiology cannot be divided or separated from epistemology. You know through ministry, you know through agape self-giving, you know through positing the signs of the wisdom of Christ, the mysterion tu Christu, the mystery in Christ of his wisdom, in order to counter all pagan mystery religions, in order to encounter and to counter and to negate the promiscuity of pagan culture, and to posit a new wisdom and a new lordship in Jesus Christ, which Paul had discovered on the Damascus Road. So we do have also for Paul the influence of Gamaliel, the Hillel Jewish school. And mainly we have to understand that after conversion, Paul did debate the Hellenistic philosophy at every area, in Jerusalem or in Tarsus or Athens, wherever he confronted it. And he translated his prior Jewish understanding into Hellenistic modes of thought. So N.T. Wright tells us that Paul's methodology was signification. He keyed in on signification. He keyed in on semeion signs. He would translate his Jewish understanding and his Jewish signs into Hellenistic modes of thought and Hellenistic signification. So N.T. Wright says that Paul addressed Greek identity and Greek philosophy at the area of signification with the fundamental sign of Christ as Kyrios Lord, and everything abbreviated under that. That gives us a first look at the idea of Paul as a philosopher, a Jewish Christian philosopher. But the Greek world, as I said at the beginning, was not the Greek philosophy of Plato. Sure, that was prevalent. The Plato's Academy, although not as structured as it had been in the BC era, even in the first century, still was loosely formed and still present. But Paul was confronting Stoicism. So we're going to look at the triad on the right, and we're going to take a look at the dominance of Stoic philosophy. We'll begin by looking at block 1. We're going to look at the first century philosophy. There were 4 schools of thought. There's Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum Academy, Stoic Academy, and Epicurean Academy. There are 4 schools of Greek philosophy. Now, Socrates was the beginning. He posited that we need to investigate beneath common assumptions, which would lead to either a new piety or a new skepticism. He posited the idea of the examined life. It was the birth of philosophy. Plato came along, and that did inform Christianity. It was informed by Plato's thought. The physical finite world is not the true world. It's a secondary finite existence. Ultimate reality is the realm of the forms and the realm of ideas. And the task of epistemology is to know these forms, these ideal forms, which are the true. He also posited the idea of the immortal soul, and his position led to either spiritual gnosis or skeptical gnosis. Now, Aristotle, he established his school in the Lyceum, known as the peripatetic school of walking while you teach. He's known for his logic of syllogism. He also developed an ethic of virtuous attributes, and he posited the idea of the divine as the unmoved mover. And the ideal forms for Aristotle were in the created manifestations in the world. They were not in a separate realm. They were present in finitude, but veiled by finitude. And so we have a triad there in note 5. We have a triad that emerges. You have Socrates, who posited the task of concrete examined life. You have Plato, who posited the truth of the examined life in a separate realm of forms. Aristotle, he enjoined Socrates and Plato dialectically and posited a concrete theory of forms that were already present in finite existence. So you've got the triad emerging of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So from here, let's move on and let's take a look at block 2, Athens and the Epicureans. They primarily represent the thought of our current Western civilization. They posited a metaphysical dualism. The gods are far removed from concrete existence. And ethics meant the self would seek to separate from finitude and achieve the tranquil spiritual state. There's no surviving soul. Paul did not borrow from Epicurean thought. He did not borrow from Epicurean thought, says N.T. Wright. What there was instead in the first century for Paul was the dominance of Stoicism. N.T. Wright says there was very much the dominance of Stoicism. Zeno established the Stoic school in Athens, but it was also in Tarsus. In Paul's day, it was the default philosophy of choice. The divinity indwelt all finite reality for Paul. Pneuma Spirit transforms all human life. He did borrow somewhat from Stoicism, but the key point here is that the Stoic view took up Aristotle. The Epicureans were taking up Plato. The Stoics were taking up Aristotle, because the divine was indwelling all of finitude. Now for me, and everyone knows from the past lessons, I have to have a visual picture. If I get a visual picture, I can grasp this truth being taught by N.T. Wright even better. So block 4 is going to be the Stoic worldview. And just follow along, and I'll kind of walk everybody through it. We begin with the eternal Logos as the creative divine reason. Out of the eternal Logos comes the divine inner principle of life. So the Logos goes out of itself. It will then be like an ether-like directing substance that will enter finite creation, which is the passive matter that is acted upon by the ether-like directing substance of Logos. Now, through humanity, the Logos enters as pneuma spirit, and the pneuma spirit determines and defines who a person truly is for the Stoics. So the pneuma spirit is like the fiery breath that directs humanity, and the Logos is the ether-like directing substance of the finite creation. Now, for all of humanity, this is a process of cohesion, said the Stoics. Now, in Greek culture, that would be called eirene, peace. It's a methodology of peace because eirene, peace, in Greek culture meant healing of fragmentation. And the Stoics did posit this movement of spirit as a healing of fragmentation, as a spiritual cohesion of healing fragmentation. But the Stoics said that the goal of humanity is to achieve, and the goal of the self is to achieve autarkes, self-sufficiency, by living in harmony with the divine principle. And that means to engage in the dialectic. And so you have the block to the far right there on the concrete engagement in dialectic. First, the self gathers cognitive impressions that are grasped. Second, the self forms logical inferences from these cognitive impressions. Third, the inferences are refined through dialogue with others and dialectic. All of this is worked out within the preordained direction of the inner Logos, ether of directing substance. That leads to, as the self and as the community progresses in greater and greater and greater alignment with the Logos, it reaches the return moment. And the return moment equals ekpyrosis, and I did not understand ekpyrosis, and so I also will have to thank N.T. Wright for helping me to understand this concept. Ekpyrosis is where the divine absorbs into himself all substance in order to purify it, then creates out of himself again. It's a cosmic dialectic of cycles for the fiery refinement of creation. It's the cosmic, or the theos, God-like dialectic at a cosmic level that takes up all of humanity in a ekpyrosis, refining purification and spiritual raising up, bringing all of humanity forward into spiritual maturity, bringing all of finite creation into a greater spiritual alignment. That's called ekpyrosis. And so the Stoic view moved from Logos to inner divine principle to ether-like directing substance to pneuma spirit as fiery directing humanity, which leads to concrete dialectic through impressions, inferences, and refined dialogue, which leads to the return of ekpyrosis, And then the eternal Logos goes out of itself again in greater and greater cycles of alignment. For the Stoic, there are cycles of greater maturity and alignment in the spiritual life. And you can see how Paul did borrow some signification here, although he certainly applied his own semeion signs through his own maturing in the mysterion to Christou, the mystery of Christ, which Paul learned and internalized through his ministry. So N.T. Wright truly gave me a wake-up call. I was very confused about Acts 17. I knew that Plato's Academy had fragmented, but I knew that it was still loosely meeting in the Court of Appeals in Athens. But I remember learning that Paul was actually invited to lecture at the Painted Porch. I never could figure that out. What was the Painted Porch? What's this Painted Porch colonnade? Well, that's where the Stoics met. The Stoics met at the Painted Porch colonnade, and the dominant philosophy in first century Greece and in Tarsus and all Greek regions, it was the Stoic philosophy. It was Stoicism. So I was very thankful to get this Block 4 graphic, because the first lesson, whenever N.T. Wright starts a new chapter, we really have to get the first teaching down, because he's going to build on it. You don't want to make a mistake early on. So we've got the foundation here of how N.T. Wright is going to progress concerning Paul's Greek identity. He gives us a very firm and very descriptive foundation. And that's from pages 197 to 216. And we will pick up next time at 217 and the next lesson in Paul's Greek identity.